March 1945. Tokyo. In a single night, a fleet of B-29 superfortresses drops a substance that will outlive the war that birthed it, and define one that hadn't started yet. Roughly 100,000 people die in the firestorm that follows. The weapon responsible isn't a new explosive. It's gel, thickened gasoline, designed to stick to whatever it touches and burn for minutes instead of seconds. The story starts 3 years earlier, in a chemistry lab at Harvard. Louis Fieser, an organic chemist with no military background, is handed a narrow problem. Incendiary bombs using rubber-thickened gasoline are unreliable. Natural rubber is scarce, and the mixture burns unevenly. The U.S. military needs something that ignites consistently, clings to vertical surfaces, and burns long enough to do real damage to wooden structures, vehicles, and fortified positions. Fieser's answer, finalized in 1942, is a mixture of naphthenic and palmitic acids used as a thickening agent for gasoline. Hence the name napalm. It is not designed as an anti-personnel weapon. It is designed to burn buildings and, by 1945, cities. That distinction will matter enormously 2 decades later, when the weapon migrates from strategic bombing campaigns to a guerrilla war fought in jungle, not in cities. Between 1942 and 1945, napalm goes from laboratory curiosity to the dominant incendiary of the Pacific War. It proves devastating against Japanese wooden construction, and engineers refine the delivery system rapidly. From improvised tank and fuse assemblies to purpose-built bomb casings with rupture seams designed to scatter burning gel over a wide radius on impact. The early formula has a flaw. Raw napalm gel is viscous but still flows, which limits how it spreads on impact and how long it clings to a target. Through the late 1940s and into Korea, formulators experiment with polystyrene-based thickeners instead of the original soap-like acids. The result, eventually standardized as Napalm B, is a mixture of gasoline, benzene, and polystyrene. It's more stable in storage, easier to manufacture at scale, and critically, it burns hotter and clings more effectively, properties that will define its use in Vietnam. By the time the United States escalates its involvement in Southeast Asia in the mid-1960s, napalm is no longer an emergency wartime improvisation. It's an industrial product, manufactured under contract, most visibly by Dow Chemical, and delivered through a mature, standardized aerial weapons system. In Vietnam, napalm solves a tactical problem that high explosives cannot. Conventional bombs kill through blast and fragmentation in a radius measured in tens of meters, and jungle canopy absorbs and deflects much of that effect. Napalm doesn't rely on blast. A single canister on rupture can spread burning gel across an area roughly 2,500 square meters. And that fire doesn't care about foliage cover, spider holes, or earthen bunkers with overhead protection that would shrug off shrapnel. For U.S. and Allied ground forces, this matters in a specific, narrow tactical window. Close air support against entrenched positions where friendly troops are too close for conventional ordnance, and where the enemy is using terrain, tunnels, tree lines, hedgerows, that defeats fragmentation weapons. Napalm strikes are credited in numerous after-action reports, with breaking ambushes and suppressing fire from fortified positions that had stalled in advance. The cost is asymmetric in a different sense. Burns from napalm are not like flash burns from explosives. The gel adheres to skin, clothing, and equipment, and continues burning through tissue layers, producing injuries with mortality and disfigurement rates far higher than equivalent-sized blast wounds. Military medical assessments of the period note that burn casualties from incendiary weapons require disproportionately long hospitalization and reconstructive care compared to conventional combat trauma, a statistic that shaped both military medical planning and, eventually, public perception of the weapon. By the height of the war, American forces are expending tens of thousands of tons of napalm annually, overwhelmingly in close air support and area denial roles rather than strategic bombing. The doctrine governing its use reflects this. Forward air controllers and ground commanders request napalm specifically when a target sits inside minimum safe distances for high explosive ordnance, or when intelligence indicates fortified positions that fragmentation alone has failed to suppress on a previous pass. Strike logs from contested provinces show a recurring pattern. Napalm follows a failed conventional strike far more often than it precedes one. In the operational logic of the period, it functions as a weapon of last resort against a specific category of target, not a default first choice. There is also a psychological dimension that period after action reports note repeatedly, separate from physical casualties. Enemy units that had absorbed artillery and small arms fire without breaking frequently abandoned fortified positions after a single napalm pass nearby. Not because the strike itself killed large numbers, but because fire spreading through a tunnel mouth or trench line removed the protective logic of the position entirely. A bunker that stops shrapnel offers no comparable defense against superheated air and burning gel, finding the same firing slits and ventilation shafts that make it habitable. That collapse of perceived safety, as much as the physical burn injuries, drove withdrawals that conventional bombardment alone had repeatedly failed to produce. Operationally, 3 design features explain the weapon's effect. First, thickening. Napalm B's gel consistency means the substance doesn't disperse like a liquid or burn out like a vapor cloud. It coats surfaces and stays put, which is what allows it to defeat overhead cover that stops blast weapons cold. Second, the ignition train. A small burster charge, not designed to fragment the casing violently, instead splits it open and scatters the gel while a pyrotechnic igniter sets it alight almost simultaneously. The goal isn't destruction through force, it's coverage and duration. Third, delivery profile. Napalm canisters are typically released from low altitude, often under 500 feet, in a near-level pass. The tumbling, skipping trajectory seen in so much combat footage isn't an accident of poor aim. It's the intended behavior, letting the canister cartwheel and spread its contents across a long, narrow footprint rather than a single point of impact, which is exactly what's needed against a tree line or a trench system rather than a single bunker. Napalm succeeded operationally because Vietnam's terrain neutralized the weapons the U.S. military was built around. Doctrine developed for the plains of Europe assumed clear sight lines and exposed armor. Vietnam offered neither. Dense canopy, fortified earthworks, and an enemy that fought from concealment created a doctrinal gap that incendiary weapons filled almost by default. Fire doesn't need a clean line of sight to a target. It only needs proximity. The weapon also exploited a specific vulnerability in fortification design. Bunkers and tunnel systems built to resist blast and shrapnel had no equivalent defense against sustained, clinging fire that consumed oxygen and heated enclosed spaces well beyond survivable limits. In effect, napalm converted defensive engineering advantages into liabilities. But the same qualities that made it tactically effective, wide area coverage, low precision, lingering combustion, made it uniquely difficult to confine to combatants. As the war extended into populated areas and contested hamlets where front lines were poorly defined, the gap between intended military effect and actual humanitarian consequence widened, and that gap became impossible to manage through engineering refinement alone. This is the structural problem napalm never escaped. It was engineered against an assumption: a target that is either clearly military or clearly civilian, in a battle space with identifiable lines. Vietnam routinely violated that assumption. Hamlets sat astride supply routes. Combatants moved through and sheltered in the same spaces as non-combatants. And a weapon calibrated for area coverage against bunkers and tree lines carried that same area coverage logic into settings where the population density made the distinction between target and vicinity of target far less meaningful than it had been over a Pacific Island airstrip in 1945. Popular memory, shaped heavily by a single 1972 photograph from Trang Bang showing a child severely burned by a napalm strike, often treats napalm as exclusively an anti-civilian terror weapon, deployed indiscriminately. The historical record is more specific. The overwhelming majority of documented napalm strikes targeted military positions, troop concentrations, and supply routes, consistent with its designed role in close air support. The myth isn't that napalm caused civilian harm. It did, and that's documented fact, not exaggeration. The myth is the implication that civilian harm was the weapon's purpose rather than a consequence of its low-precision delivery profile being used in a war with no stable front line. The distinction matters for understanding why it was used the way it was, even if it doesn't soften the outcome for those affected. Napalm in Vietnam wasn't a weapon designed for that war. It was a weapon from an earlier conflict, refined for an earlier kind of target, applied to a battlefield that happened to match its strengths almost perfectly. It solved real tactical problems, defeating overhead cover, suppressing entrenched fire, denying terrain that conventional ordnance couldn't touch. It did this by trading precision for coverage, a trade-off that produced both its battlefield effectiveness and its enduring controversy. By the war's end, that trade-off had become politically unsustainable even where it remained tactically sound. A rare case where a weapon's technical success and its strategic survivability moved in opposite directions.